Yeah, I think it's live streaming now. We can begin.
A very good afternoon to everyone. My name is Arfina Ara Hussain, and I am a research intern at ICS, and I will be the MC for today's session. On behalf of ICS, I welcome you all to today's Wednesday seminar. The topic of today's discussion is Foreign and Economic Strategies of a Globalizing China and India-China Relation during the period of Jiang Zemin, 1926 to 2022. Our first panelist for today's discussion is Mr. Ashok K. Kantha, former ambassador of India to China, honorary fellow and former director, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. He is a distinguished fellow at Vivekananda International Foundation, New Delhi, and a chair of the core group on China of the Confederation of Indian Industry. His talk will highlight how Zemin's period was a productive period for China as the country came out of its relative isolation and mended its relationship with the West, integrated with the global economy, and readied for its role as a global power. However, with dramatic rise, China also faced many challenges like corruption, iniquities. The period also saw normal relation between India and China. However, boundary settlement remained elusive and problems like China-Pakistan strategic linkages deepened. And our second panelist is Santosh Pai. He is an honorary fellow and treasurer at the Institute of Chinese Studies and a partner at Link Legal, an Indian law firm. He has been offering legal services to clients in India-China corridor since 2010. His areas of interest include Chinese investment in India, India-China comparative law and policy, cross-cultural negotiations, and board governance. His talk will highlight how the foundation for expansion of India-China economic ties was also laid during this period. Various asymmetries in their economic ties that can be seen today can be traced back to this period. The widening gap between the two countries' economic indicators highlight their respective comparative advantages. Also, it will also discuss how the period holds lessons for India's post-pandemic journey towards prominence in global supply chain. Joining us as our chair is Professor Alka Acharya. She is the honorary director of the ICS and professor at the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, JNU. She has been teaching courses on Chinese foreign policy and political economy to the master's and MPhil students and guiding doctoral research since 1993. Most recently, she has edited a volume titled Boundaries and Borderlands, a century after the 1914 Simla Convention. Full bio of our panelists can be perused from the webinar newsletter, which is available at our website. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to request all the participants to follow some housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself muted during the discussion. Participants can unmute themselves only when asked by the chair to do so. Participants can post their comments and questions in the chat box, or they can use the Zoom raise hand option. With that, I now hand over the floor to the chair. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Arfina. A very good afternoon to all of you who have joined us today for this discussion on Jiang Zemin's legacy, both in terms of foreign policy of the PRC and its foreign economic policies, with specific reference to India-China relations. We have with us two panelists who have already been introduced to you, who will each address these two aspects, the foreign policy and global and India-China, and Santosh, who will look at the India-China economic dynamics. And the point really here is that in the passing away of Jiang Zemin, we are looking at his period to understand the very interesting shift that takes place in both India-China relations, as well as in Chinese foreign policy generally. And Jiang Zemin's legacy has been to consolidate the policy of good neighborly relations that had been started by Deng Xiaoping in the late 70s, in which India came to occupy an important part. The 1990s, generally, if we look at the three levels at which China had started to operate in a much more significant fashion. At the global level, the backdrop during Jiang Zemin's period was also China's attempts to become a member of the WTO. And it was clearly facing a great deal of pressure. In fact, at that point of time, it was not generally understood the extent to which China was conceding in its desire to become a member of the WTO. But clearly, that was a very, very important objective for Chinese foreign policy, particularly. It's very important desire to join the global economy. At the regional level, we see that there is a big shift. China's neighborhood policy, particularly with regard to South Asia.
Alka, you're muted.
All this while I was muted.
No, just now. Yeah.
Oh, so sorry. I don't know how that got. Somebody must have muted me. One of the my hands were not at all. Anyway, my apologies for that brief glitch. But so what I was saying was that at the level of the neighborhood, we see Jiang Zemin also contributing very significantly to a shift in the 1990s, which was we see China adopting a more even-handed approach towards the region, and particularly where India-Pakistan dynamics were concerned. And we recall Jiang Zemin's visit to Islamabad, where he advised the Senate that put your problem with India on the back burner, improve the relations, improve trade ties, and then sort out the matter. So that was a brief period when China did try to move away from its overtly pro-Pakistan policy. And specifically with India-China relations, we see what Ambassador Kantha and Santosh will tell us, a kind of a jump that the relationship gets both in economic and political terms. To what extent did that period, that legacy of Jiang Zemin actually leave, what kind of legacy did it leave for future or the subsequent leaders to build on? Did it actually create the foundations for a substantial India-China partnership? Did it address the fundamental issues in ways that could be that could offer some lessons for us today? I think these are some of the issues that I hope our panelists will touch upon. And let me then request Ashok to give his presentation.
Thank you, Alka. So since time is rather short, so let me use a PowerPoint presentation to sort of is my screen visible?
No, sir.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay, let me just share it then. What's happening?
Yes, sir. It's visible.
It's visible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Well, in the short time available, I'll try to cover, these four areas briefly. One, foreign strategies of China under Jiang Zemin's leadership, and I'm looking at 1989 to 2002 when he stepped down as General Secretary of the CPC. And then economic strategy, some highlights, because that will also be covered by Santosh. Then dwell on India-China relations, something I was closely involved with from 92 to 96 for more than 4 years. when I was Director China and Ministry of External Affairs, and then give some broad conclusions. Looking at foreign strategies of China, what we need to recall that when Jiang Zemin took over under very difficult circumstances immediately after crackdown in Tiananmen Square, there was a breakdown of China's relations with the US-led West. But at the same time, China, under leadership of Deng Xiaoping and his cohort, was very keen to restore this relationship because, as Alka brought out, it wanted to integrate with the global marketplace. It wanted to take advantage of opportunities created by globalization, and it realized that the policy of reform opening up would not succeed without support of the West led by the USA. You are all aware of Deng Xiaoping's strategy of 24 characters. I was reading a recent essay by Dr. Hu Wei, and he suggests that Deng's strategy was outlined in several speeches he delivered in late 1980s, early 1992, early 1990s. It was Jiang Zemin who summarized the strategy in a concise 24-character policy. As you're aware, that is observe calmly, secure our position, take one's time before reacting, hide our capacities, and bide our time, maintain a low profile, and never claim leadership. Whether or not Chiang had a major role in crafting of this policy, there's no doubt that he very faithfully implemented this strategy. And this ensured that the Jiang Zemin era was a rather productive period for China. Specifically, in terms of foreign policy orientation, China was very keen to avoid confrontation with the USA. And this is despite three major crises which occurred during his period. You had Taiwan Strait crisis of 1995-96, US bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in May 1999, and collision of US surveillance aircraft with PLA aircraft over South China Sea in April 2001. In all three cases, China initially took very belligerent positions and very deliberately unleashed nationalist forces, but did so in a calibrated fashion with room for reconciliation. All three cases, China did arrive at reconciliation with USA before too long. And then, of course, efforts to make up with the USA continued when Bill Clinton took over as president. He started with a lot of apprehensions about China, including its human rights record. But then, Jiang Zemin undertook his visit to USA in October, November 1997, Charm Offensive. And Bill Clinton records in memoir that how he came to the conclusion that China will become more open. So, this illusion about peaceful, change taking place in China had already taken root in USA. And in fact, during that visit, the joint statement included a formulation on constructive strategic partnership. The only time China and USA have talked about a strategic partnership. And also, rather importantly, from our point of view, the joint statement referred to China and USA working together to maintain global and regional peace and security, including in South Asia. Then we had visit of Bill Clinton to China in 1998, June 1998, when, as Alka mentioned, Jiang Zemin and his colleagues worked very assiduously to get this concession from Clinton on USA supporting China's membership of WTO, which was a very high priority for them. And then there was, this infamous joint presidential statement on South Asia, which was issued, and this happened soon after India's nuclear tests in the preceding month, in May 1998. A similar, tack was used by China in its dealings with EU, where it sort of underlined its importance as an emerging market, and kind of attraction it had for European countries. Very carefully exploited divisions among European countries, used carrot and stick policy to advance its agenda, and by and large managed to finesse concerns about human rights and other issues, both in the USA and EU. And the West was taken in by this perception that there will be peaceful evolution of China, that China will become more like us over a period of time. There will be political reforms following up on economic reforms, something which proved to be unrealistic expectation. And this was jettisoned fully only during Trump presidency recently. In China, there were very deep concerns about the strategic intentions of the USA, particularly after collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But they sort of underplayed those concerns and instead handled issues like human rights in a very sort of low-key, deft fashion, where process itself became important without yielding anything on substance in those talks. And China was very clear not to challenge US hegemony or leadership during the Jiang Zemin period. I think that's a very important part of China's external strategy. Likewise, when it comes to relations with Russia, after breakup of 1991, there was the unipolar moment when the geopolitical situation was heavily stacked against countries like China, because kind of leverage China had vis-a-vis USA because of Cold War rivalry between the USA and the Soviet Union had dissipated. So China had to do a course correction both in its relations with the West and its engagement with Russia. And it adjusted to change geopolitical context rather deftly. With Russia, it entered into very major agreement on CBMs in 1996, moved towards resolution of boundary dispute, on which the agreement was ratified in 2005, but a whole lot of work was done when Jiang Zemin was president. It got into arms supply relationship with Russia, which is very important because the US-led West had stopped any arms supplies to China, and likewise managed to persuade Russia to give its acquiescence to expanded footprint to Russia in Central Asia. With Japan, likewise, China managed to expand trade investment linkages and also became the largest beneficiary of ODA given by Japan, while at the same time very deliberately keeping alive the history issue and other pressure points in the relationship, which were sort of utilized later. Without going to detail, let me just mention that there was also major reaching out to ASEAN, Africa, and Latin America without seeking to take a leadership role in Global South. And very deliberately, China did not try to position itself as a successor to the former Soviet Union when it comes to the global communist movement. I think that was another bit of advice given by Deng about keeping low profile and never claiming leadership. The net result is that by the time Jiang Zemin stepped down as General Secretary of CPC in 2002, the taint of Tiananmen had been eliminated. And China was poised to play a much larger and more forceful role in the region and beyond under Hu Jintao. And the opportunity for that really emerged in the immediate aftermath of global economic crisis in 2008-2009. Coming to economic strategies, Santosh will also cover that. So let me just highlight some key points here. One that Jiang Zemin and Chu Rongqi very assiduously implemented the policy reform on opening up, though Chiang is said to have some reservations initially, and Deng Xiaoping had to nudged the leadership to move towards greater reform and opening up. You're aware of his southern tour of 1992. But Chiang and Chu took ownership of the reform process after the initial post-Tiananmen debate had reached to a conclusion, where China decided to continue with the policy reform and opening up. I'll just mention some of the highlights of the policy under atomic strategies under Jiang Zemin. One, of course, very important is wooing the West and attracting FDI, something which worked rather well. Second, I think very important is transformation of SOEs, state-owned enterprises, under direct charge of Premier Chu Rongchi. And there the mantra was grasp the large, let go of the small. So keep control on very large SOEs, the strategic sectors like telecommunication or mining or banking, but essentially privatize smaller SOEs, which was done within a short period of time. A third major initiative was opening of the housing sector. And this was really dramatic, what happened in late 1990s, and monetization of land. All land belonged to state, but the way it was sort of monetized both for urban construction, for opening up of housing sector, and to generate revenue for local governments and central government. This became a very major engine of growth, especially when complemented by mass movement of people from rural areas and hinterland to vibrant coastal provinces. And this was done without any attempt to bring about hookah reform. Then, of course, there was China's entry into WTO that Alka referred to. This was a very difficult decision because, as Alka mentioned, China had to make some major concessions, including in terms of reduction of tariffs. And both the Chiang and Chu came under considerable political pressure internally, but they could manage to persuade their colleagues that this is something in long-term interest of China. And this proved to be a decisive step because this really set the foundation for China's emergence as the largest trading nation in the world, as manufacturing hub and factory of the world. That wouldn't have been possible without China's entry into WTO, for which China was prepared to pay a relatively high price, though it didn't fully deliver on many commitments it made at that time, including in bilateral agreement it had with India. Then another big step taken by Jiang Zemin was co-opting business entrepreneurs and professionals into ranks of Communist Party of China under his three represents theory. This really led to giving a big boost to private sector in China. And then he also tried to take PLA out of business corporations, business activities, where it was heavily engaged until late 1990s. And finally, launch of infrastructure building binge, including initiatives like Putong, which started during Jiang Zemin's period. In terms of outcomes, I will highlight 5 of them. Double-digit growth of China's GDP during 13 years of Jiang Zemin period. Private sector really taking off. A big boost to urbanization and infrastructure. And as I mentioned earlier, stage being set for China's emergence as leading trading nation, manufacturing hub, and factory of the world. But it came with certain consequences. For instance, when the state sector was restructured, it was done in a manner which was really rampant with corruption, with Communist Party functionaries getting directly involved in business activities through the relatives, sometimes taking stakes on their own. There was systemic corruption, in fact, which was encouraged. In fact, Jiang Zemin made this statement, keeping quiet while making a fortune. And this was directed both towards domestic entrepreneurs as also multinational companies which were operating in China. inequality increased hugely, economic imbalances increased, urban-rural divide and interregional disparities increased, and party in business. It really led to weakening of credibility of Communist Party of China to a significant extent. Something later Xi Jinping talked about quite bluntly, including in his work report at the 20th Party Congress. Let me now move to India-China relations. As I mentioned earlier, I was directly involved during 4 years of Jiang Zemin's period in managing this relationship. Initially, our approach was to build on the basic paradigm which was developed during Gandhi's visit to China in December 1988, and we did not allow the turbulence of Tiananmen incident to affect our trajectory of India-China relations. The understanding during Rajiv Gandhi's visit was essentially that we'll try to address the boundary question. In the interim, we'll maintain peace and tranquility in border areas, and simultaneously we will develop relations across the board in our engagement with China. On the first issue, boundary question, there was no progress, frankly, during the Jiang Zemin era, because Chinese remained wedded to their position on what they call Tung Tiao Shirang. That is, India making big adjustments in eastern sector, and China making corresponding concessions in the western sector. This was not acceptable to us because we could not cede any significant territory in eastern sector. So gap between position two sides was so large that we came to the conclusion that we need to focus on maintenance of peace and tranquility in border areas. And this became more urgent after the Wangtung incident of June 1986, which led to India-China borders becoming live for a period of 1 year plus. Situation rather difficult. They were dialing down, but both sides came to the conclusion that we must have a structure for managing borders and ensuring peace and tranquilities. So we had these two landmark agreements, one in September 1993 and one in November 1996. I was involved in both these agreements, second one as the main negotiator. And essentially, we put in place the framework for management of borders on the basis of line of actual control, as distinct from an international boundary, because we didn't have an agreement on international boundary. And I would argue that notwithstanding difficulties along India-China borders, this framework has served us well and contributed to a great extent in ensuring peace in border areas for nearly 3 decades. But on other issues, Chinese were not particularly responsive. For instance, we repeatedly raised with them issue of covert and overt assistance given by China to Pakistan, including for the latter's nuclear and missile program. They did not provide any satisfaction to us. Though when it comes to other countries in South Asia, they were a little more forthcoming. I was subsequently deputy chief mission in Kathmandu, and I remember that at that time Chinese had essentially advised the Nepalese that you need to work with India, that we will not be able to come to your rescue if you have a major problem with India. That kind of approach has been completely jettisoned in recent years, where they were more mindful of our concerns in South Asia, with the exception of Pakistan. Now, Jiang Zemin visited India in November 1996, which was the first ever visit of president of the PRC to India, and it also saw signing of the agreement on military CBMs. It was a productive visit, but equally important or equally interesting was what he did. After visiting India, he went to Pakistan, and Alka has referred to the remarks he made in the Pakistan Senate. I have in my slide, I have quoted the remark. He did quite refer to Kashmir or India-Pakistan relations directly, but his message was very clear. Our message was that you need to sort of set aside issues or differences which cannot be resolved for the time being, and develop normal state-to-state relations. That's how this message was read in Pakistan. They were rather upset about it at that point in time. Also because by then China had started taking a more nuanced and balanced position on Kashmir. They had stopped referring to UN resolutions that started suggesting that India and Pakistan should resolve boundary issue through bilateral discussion, which was our position. And they had stopped referring to things like Indian hegemony in South Asia. So this was a period, as Alka mentioned, of a more nuanced and balanced position taken by China in South Asia. But there was a major shift in Chinese position following India's nuclear tests in May 1998. And in particular, Chinese were upset by a letter Prime Minister Vajpayee wrote to President Bill Clinton on 11th May 1998, where China threat and China's nexus with Pakistan was projected as providing the main reason for India deciding to opt for nuclear tests. So Chinese were upset with nuclear tests, but they were far more upset with the fact that we had, in a very authoritative manner, projected the narrative of China threat. And this letter was quickly leaked by the American side to New York Times 2 days after it was sent to Bill Clinton. And the Chinese reaction was very strong. Essentially, relations were put in on the back burner. China worked very closely with USA at that time, for instance, on UN Security Council resolution on 1172 on condemning nuclear tests by India and Pakistan. But in its public pronouncements, it was critical of India, but not of Pakistan. So it adopted a very sort of one-sided approach. And then, of course, I referred earlier to US-China joint statement of 27 June 1998 on South Asia during Clinton's visit, which again was read very adversely in India. But beginning that period, there was a lot of back channel diplomacy, exchange of visits. Then External Affairs Minister Jaswant Singh visited China in June 1999, and Chinese are demanding that the side which had tied the knot must untie the knot. So we agreed at that time to give a public assurance that India does not regard China as a threat. And then subsequently, President Narayanan visited China in May-June 2002 to mark the 50th anniversary of establishment of diplomatic relations. And this resulted in normalcy being restored in India-China relations after a hiatus of about 2 years. And then from Chinese side, Foreign Minister Tang Chia-Xuan visited India in June 2000, capping the process of restoration normalcy. So this became a very difficult process, which was carefully managed by two sides. But in the interim period, we had the Kargil conflict in 1999. And by that time, tensions had already eased in relation between India and China took a neutral position. It did not come out in support of Pakistan, partly because Americans had by that time readjusted the position regarding China. They had sort of moved slightly away from their identification with China. That happened during Clinton's visit the previous year. And they had also blamed Pakistan directly for the Kargil conflict. So China also, various pronouncements avoided any reference to United Nations UN resolutions, as Chinese permanent representative Chin Hua-sun had done in General Assembly during height of the nuclear tension on 6 June 1998. So it was the position was carefully balanced between India and Pakistan. On the whole, I'll suggest that there was pragmatism in management of India-China relations, and the stage was set for major expansion of cooperation in trade and other areas that I'm sure Santosh will talk about. I'll just give you one example of pragmatism. In 1994, France stopped providing enriched uranium for Tarapur nuclear power plant, and we approached China, and Chinese agreed to provide nuclear fuel to us, and the deliveries started from China Nuclear Energy Corporation in January 1995. So they were being pragmatic about it, notwithstanding differences on NPT, etc. And one of the contributing factor was that there was greater symmetry in strengths of two countries at that time, unlike the situation we have at this point of time. Geopolitical situation also sort of required China to reach out to India, except that I referred to the aftermath of nuclear tests when they adopted a rather belligerent posture, but that was also toned down as USA readjusted its tilts toward China beginning late 1998. And it moved towards an understanding with India, which culminated, as you know, India-US nuclear accord subsequently. But on difficult issues like boundary question or China-Pakistan nexus and other major irritants relationship, China did not show any flexibility. I think that's the bottom line. So pragmatic, but not flexible when it comes to big issues. Finally, in terms of conclusions, let me highlight a few points. One, as you know, Jiang Zemin was something of an accidental leader. When Deng and his colleagues decided to sack Chaoxiang, Jiang Zemin was brought in from Shanghai. He was not really expected to be a strong leader at that point of time. In fact, there were doubts about his survival because two of his predecessors, Hu Yaoping and Chao Tsiang, had been sacked. There was a report a few days ago by Nikkei Asia, which argues that Deng Xiaoping wanted to fire Jiang Zemin even before he could launch major reforms because he was unhappy with the slow pace of progress on economic reforms. We don't know whether that report is correct, but gradually Jiang Zemin managed to emerge out of shadows of Deng Xiaoping, who stopped playing a larger role in Chinese politics, especially after 1994, when his Parkinson's condition became quite bad. And on the whole, Jiang Zemin left a legacy which is often underestimated. It was 13 years he was a leader of China. It was a very productive period for the country. It created foundations for rise of China, both as an economic behemoth and as a major power. And he managed to repair relations with US, EU, and Japan. There was major expansion in ties with ASEAN, Africa, and Latin America. And equally important, he could reduce US ability to contain China. He had learned some lessons from Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995-96, when he had to back off because he was not in a position to really deal with two aircraft carrier groups that Clinton had sent to Taiwan Strait. So I think they reduced US ability to intervene in such situations in future. As I mentioned, there was progress in relations with India despite occasional turbulence, particularly after nuclear tests, India's nuclear test, and underlying problems which continued unaddressed in a way. He also put in place building blocks for China's subsequent assertion of so-called core interests and power in terms of economic and military strengths, diplomatic outreach, and narrative. And narrative is something I think we tend to ignore, how much continuity there is between narrative which was projected during Chiang's period and what we are witnessing today. You need to look at the speech given by Jiang Zemin in the function celebrating 80th anniversary of founding of CPC in 2001. I don't know, much of the terminology which was used very similar to what is being used now. Like he dwelt extensively on century of humiliation, even though he was trying to repair relations with the West. And this construct of great rejuvenation of Chinese nation, and how it's possible only under stewardship of CPC. Later, of course, as you know, it became China Dream under Xi Jinping. But there's a lot of negative aspects, legacy also, including systemic corruption I talked about, greatly increased inequalities. But on the whole, China emerged much stronger following 13 years of Jiang Zemin's stewardship of the party and government. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ashok. That was an extremely comprehensive account. And I think it provided a lot of detail along with analysis of the more critical points in during the reign of Jiang Zemin. I think if the slide can be.
Yeah, I'm just trying to.
All right, thanks. So, Santosh, you are now taking charge of the floor and providing us with the other side of the coin.
Thank you, Professor Acharya. Yes, I think Ambassador's presentation was extremely comprehensive, including first-hand experience. It's difficult to follow this kind of an intervention, but I will try to do something a little different. This is a series of, I think, seminars you're organizing on Jiang Zemin's.
Sorry to interrupt, Santosh. Are you also having a PPT?
No, that's
Okay,
not my screen.
Okay, so.
Okay, let me just, I think it's my screen. Yeah.
Okay. So last week's Wednesday seminar, I think Priyanka did a good job of focusing on SOE reforms and also to some extent China's entry into WTO. So I'll try to do something similar. I will choose one particular aspect of Jiang Zemin's legacy on the economic side, which I think showcases very well his leadership, both the good and the bad of his leadership. And hopefully that will provide some food for thought. So as Ambassador said, there were 6 or 7 major items on the economic agenda when Jiang Zemin came to power. They included getting the military out of the economy, breaking up monopolies. Of course, inflation was at its peak, and banking reform. Now, when we talk about economic strategies, it will be a joint team of Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji I refer to, because as we know, customarily, economic issues are the prerogative of the premier. And Zhu Rongji was first president of People's Bank of China, and then he became the premier. So I'll talk about tax reforms in 94, because I believe that laid the foundation for everything China achieved later on. This issue was very crucial for the domestic economy of China, how the tax revenues were split between center and state. It also helped Jiang Zemin consolidate his power because he was an accidental leader, as Ambassador said. So let me just give you a brief review of what was the tax position before. One can describe the center-state distribution of taxes before Jiang Zemin as more or less ad hoc. It was basically SOEs, producing what the state wanted and generating a bit of surplus, which was sold in the open market. There was some experimentation. There's the famous Sichuan model of experiments that were being carried out under Deng, which included everything from employment, breaking the iron bowl, to taxes and so on. So when Jiang Zemin came to power, the macroeconomic situation was very bad. The central government was really struggling to finance a lot of its budget. So this was really an urgent need. And Jiang Zemin was in a very, I think, difficult position, because having come from Shanghai, Shanghai is one of the rich coastal sort of regions of China, which was benefiting under the current system, which basically supported all the rich industrialized provinces. So for him to assume a position in the central leadership and make a complete U-turn and argue in the opposite direction of asking for a bigger share of revenue for the center was quite a difficult task. And in the mid 1980s, the central leadership had tried some experiments which had failed. And it came upon Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji to revive all these experiments. So in 1989, at the fifth plenum, there was a call for adequate centralization of the revenue collection system so that the share of the center goes up. But there was complete breakdown of consensus in the central leadership, and the provincial governments took a very big advantage of this. And Guangdong, Liaoning, Jiangsu, and a lot of these industrialized provinces fought for their corner and said, refused to be party to this reform. And it did not help that Deng was continuously focusing on fast growth and did not have any patience for restructuring of the economy and other such, painful long-term reform that was required for the economy. And when he nominated Zhu Rongji, in fact, Deng said, there's no one in Beijing who understands economics, but Zhu Rongji will be one of them. And Jiang Zemin, of course, had to support Zhu Rongji's reforms in this direction. Now, the interesting period that I could examine was really 1993, because this is when, in the beginning of the year, there was still no sign of reforms. And when the NPC met in March, there was absolutely no preparation to launch these reforms. In fact, Deng dominated the session. But surprisingly, on April 1st of 1993, Jiang Zemin, so to speak, took the initiative and said, this is something important we have to achieve. And then began a few months of hectic political activity, which I think epitomizes even till today how China works when it comes to particularly economic issues. So in May, CAS published a paper, China Academy of Social Sciences, citing Yugoslavia as an example about what happens when the central government runs out of money. In June, Jiang said this reform is indispensable, and there was a debate in the papers with Jingji Ribao and Renmin Ribao taking two sides and arguing out the position. In July, 20 work teams were pushed out to various provinces. And Zhu even said that this kind of tax contracting system, which we have on an ad hoc basis, simply will not do for a market economy, which we are aspiring for. It took until August for Deng Xiaoping to actually put his weight behind these reforms. And he criticized localism when he heard that a lot of provinces were opposing this reform. And seizing the momentum, Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin visited almost 15 to 16 provinces with a team of 60 officials to push for these reforms. And here there are some very interesting anecdotes. There were shouting matches, and the party secretary of Jiangsu was sacked for speaking too openly against these reforms. A coalition of NGOs and think tanks was prepared to argue for these reforms and to make it a fait accompli for these Communist Party political leaders who had little background in economic issues. Finally, the PLA played a role in sort of endorsing these reforms, because PLA was to be the biggest beneficiary. Because if the central government got a higher share of revenue from the provinces, earlier Deng and Jiang had made a promise of a continued 10% annual increase in the PLA's budget for the next 10 years. And this could only happen if the tax revenues of the central government was increased. So PLA, of course, backed Jiang at this stage. So finally, on December 15th, 1993, Jiang Zemin managed to make an announcement that these reforms were being rolled out. He actually used Deng's pronouncements to say this is the proper attitude to implement what Deng had earlier announced. He also made Guangdong a model, the biggest troublemaker amongst the provinces, because it had accepted the reform package. And then, of course, in 94, a lot of other documents were released to implement this. But a lesson from this that emerges is that there was no serious thinking of the kind of administrative bureaucracy that was required to implement this. So, there are a number of criticisms after this up to 97. But what is not in doubt is within 1 year, the share of the central government's revenue jumped from about 20% to 30% and so on. But a lot of concessions were made. And what this exemplifies is a number of things. So Jiang's strong leadership, including a complete turnaround. Chu Rongji, who had been the champion of the Pudong development area outside Shanghai, was instrumental in pacifying, the Shanghai voices and building consensus for this. Jiang Zemin headed 3 small groups, which is not likely for a president of China to argue for this reform. Of course, he engaged and traveled extensively within China, which is again unusual because a central leader traveling in the provinces lobbying for reform is quite unusual. Chu was, of course, consistent and harsh. So what were the compromises here? There were many compromises made. 1993 was taken as a base year so that provinces were assured that their revenue will not dip below 93. Distribution was linked to provincial taxes. This is very important when we talk about FDI, because without this kind of incentive, the provinces in China wouldn't have attracted FDI to the extent they did in the coming years. Then it was also promised that the center will not delegate expenditure items to the provinces. This was, of course, breached. So that is also one of the criticisms of this policy. But in the end, what really made this possible, adoption of these reforms, is that the economic boom softened all the opposition, and the provinces could easily see that if we actually embrace FDI and global trade, it is possible to offset whatever revenue loss we are generating because of this reform. And this is how consensus was built. Now, this for me is one of the longest standing contributions, because everything else that they did, like banking reform and so on, it was a one-time measure. It had to be done. Similarly, opening up to FDI and trade. But tax reform, even till today, every year, I think once in 3 years now, when the provincial leaders travel to Beijing, it is still kind of a suspense about how tax appropriation is done in China. So for me, Jiang's legacy is really epitomized by this episode. So having dwelt upon one single reform, I'll now move on to the India-China aspects, which is also very interesting because this was a period when more than 1,000 SOEs were pushed onto the stock exchange. And as you all know, once you are on the stock exchange, it's almost like a treadmill. You have to keep performing. So they were really encouraged to build, construct, expand capacities, and import whatever they required. And this is where, in 91, when India opened up, India was obviously forced to liberalize at short notice. So India was not very prepared in terms of manufacturing capacity to start exporting finished products. But India definitely had plenty of raw materials. So it was almost like a complementary, it was a complement to China's expansion, because China's appetite for raw materials as it grew. And this could be controlled, as Ambassador said, the normalcy in India-China ties meant that China could have gone anywhere else for these raw materials, but it chose to expand trade with India. I don't think this is an accident, because at this stage, the industry was heavily concentrated in the hands of SOEs. And if China wanted to not to promote trade with India, it could have been so. So this period was a rapid expansion in trade. India, at the end of Jiang Zemin's tenure, became, I think, one of the major partners for China, I think number 16 or so. Well, of course, not as big as US or Japan, but India, considering its size at that stage, this was, of course, quite a stark expansion of trade. Now, composition of trade at the end of Jiang Zemin's tenure, 56% of India's exports were still raw materials. which is something that continues, even today. India and China competed only for 25% of their export basket. So this gives you a sense of how the gap had widened in the 10, 15 years since India opened up. Maybe in 91, this gap was much smaller, but there was a lot of overlap between what China could sell to the world and India could sell. But by 2004, this had reduced to about 25% of the basket. And having covered this, I think now to reflect on what India could perhaps learn from this stage of China's rapid expansion. Ambassadors already referred to some of the negative pitfalls like corruption, rapid privatization, and so on. But the strong appetite for reform is definitely a takeaway for India. China was, despite a lot of pain, lowered tariff barriers because of its impending entry into WTO. India has been much slower. On the other hand, India has instituted a number of cases. Even before Jiang Zemin stepped down, India had instituted a number of WTO disputes against China. And SEZs is one more area where China excelled, and that really helped it to promote global exports, which is again, I think, something India has struggled with. We have a number of SEZs, but majority of them are in the software side, and manufacturing is something that we are still working on. And to end, I will just say that enlargement of state capacity in China that occurred under Jiang Zemin, on the economic side, I'm not talking about politics here, was something tremendous, right from domestic reform that are required to make China a global player, including bilateral economic ties. Its trade with US grew dramatically and surpassed Japan within the space of 3 to 4 years. This requires a lot of focus on specific objectives. So these are some of the lessons I think we can learn. There was not much investment between India and China during Jiang Zemin's era. So I can't speak much to that, but FDI inflows per se, China had managed to attract at least double on an annual basis compared to what India was attracting as FDI in 2004. Today, the gap is much wider. I think it's about 5 or 6 times that China attracts in terms of FDI compared to what India does. So this is really the reason I would conclude that this was the stage when some of these foundations were laid for India, China. For good or bad, we have not been able to shake it off. I'll end here. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I think one is never too sure what kind of a reaction is happening when we hear this whole account of India-China economic relations. I mean, there is it's a kind of a mixed bag of lost opportunities, inability to capitalize, problem areas which have actually many times created more obstacles. And one wonders you did mention that there are plenty of things that one can learn from the entire China story. But it seems to me that the politics and economics of India-China relations is not quite a simple and straightforward affair. I mean, they both feed into each other. And while in the main, my view is that it is politics which is in the driving seat and which conveys the signals to the economic aspects. Do you believe, and this is just to kickstart the whole discussion, you can take it up later, but do you believe that we can reach a point where the economic dimension acquires an autonomous kind of aspect in the relationship? That is to say that it will not be affected unduly by the ups and downs and will continue to build on the kind of trajectory that should be part of the economic relationship between two huge economies. So where exactly lies or where exactly falls the shadow? I mean, that's essentially what I'm asking. But we'll open this up now. And at the moment, I don't see any questions in the chat box. So neither are there any raised hands. So anybody, the floor is open. Yes, Shubhadeep has already stepped in. Go ahead, Shubhadeep.
Yeah, hello, ma'am. And Amazar sir and Santosh sir, it's a very interactive session. Sir, my question in regard of the present scenario, the latest clash that is happening, and also in terms of the opening of the market of the China. So my first question is that since once the China has opened up the economy and the investment started to flow, so in some sense it me that it has by how past the stage of import substitution industrialization ISI. So do you think that is in the long run has the effect on the Chinese economy, given that the US still holds a leverage of putting a sanction and thereby having some sort of impact on the economy? And second, given that even after the COVID, our trade deficit with China has gone up. So the, the rhetoric or the type of reaction that India is showing to China is somehow being diluted because of this trade deficit. So these are the two questions.
Okay, thank you, Shubhadeep. Well,
There's also a question in the chat box
it has come in.
from Venkat. Yeah.
All right. So Venkat is putting a question to Ambassador Kant. That in your presentation, you spoke about the initial belligerence shown by China while handling the three crises during the Jiang Zemin era. What was the influence of PLA in the belligerence and China's foreign policy during Jiang Zemin's era? Okay, I'll add a small one to this, and then maybe you could both take these first two sets of questions. Ashok, I was rather, intrigued by the formulation that you gave, which was that despite two landmark agreements, the border just did not really prove itself amenable to any kind of solution. And I wonder why that is the case. That trade was beginning to show great signs of, on the rise. And the economic aspect, that is to say, was beginning to look very promising. These two agreements, 93, 96, the even-handedness that China was showing towards the region, a clear desire that China's foreign policy overall was projecting about stabilizing its relationships in the neighborhood. I mean, with all this in many ways quite positive, why is it that we could not really move towards coming to some kind of a compromise on the boundary? So I just put that there, and you could probably take both these questions first, and then Santosh can take in the two questions that came to him.
Okay. Let me start with the question Alka raised. In my presentation, I covered, the Jiang Zemin period, stopping with 2002. We took another initiative in 2003 when Prime Minister Vajpayee visited China, and he had actually a meeting with Jiang Zemin also. I had accompanied him for that visit. During Jiang Zemin period, we did explore possibility of progress in joint working group mechanism, which was headed by Foreign Secretary on our side and Vice Foreign Minister on Chinese side. But quickly we ran into sort of a roadblock there, because as I mentioned, the Chinese were not showing any give in their position on the boundary question. they had started taking a position beginning 1985 that I referred to, Tung Kiao Shirang, that is, India must make big adjustments in the eastern sector, and then China will make corresponding concession in western sector. This is something which we have never accepted, and it's very difficult for any government of India to make large concessions in Arunachal Pradesh. So we didn't quite make any headway. Chinese, unlike their negotiations with Russia, where they had come to the conclusion that they must have early boundary settlement, and headway was made during Jiang Zemin period, though final agreement was ratified in 2005 after it stepped down as president. They had not come to any such conclusion with India. And I think that situation remains in a way unchanged. They believe that time is on their side, that with passage of time, they'll get a better settlement because gap between India and China will increase. They also tend to use the unresolved boundary question as a pressure point. And this partly addresses question Shubhadeep has raised. They do keep activating border areas, as they did in Eastern Ladakh in 2020, as they did on 9th December in Yangtze area of Tawang in eastern sector. So there's the gap in positions of India and China during Jiang Zemin period and even now is so large that there's no realistic possibility of bridging that gap and arriving at a settlement. That's why we took a very conscious decision to focus on peace and tranquility, because we didn't want another Wang Tung kind of situation occurring in border areas. 1993 agreement, Shiv Shankar Menon has written about it in his book Choices. He was main negotiator. I was assisting him at that time. And so both that agreement and 96 agreement on military CBMs, which basically builds on the foundation of 93 agreement, we focused on maintenance of peace and tranquility on the basis of construct of line of actual control. So this situation remains in a way unchanged. So some people are now questioning whether it was a mistake on our part to focus on CBMs and LAC as distinct from boundary settlement, but that was a realistic assessment we made at that time, and we decided to proceed. I believe when to hindsight also, one can say that it has served us well, because it essentially ensured peaceful borders with China for nearly 3 decades, which was no mean achievement. Coming to Venkat's question about handling of 3 crises which occurred in China-US relations during Jiang Zemin's watch, Taiwan Strait crisis, and then you had a bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and then crash of Chinese PLA aircraft following collision with US aircraft. All 3 cases, I think more than PLA, it's a political leadership which wanted to take a strong nationalistic position, and they manipulated public opinion in a manner which put pressure on the Americans. For instance, after Belgrade bombing of Chinese embassy, even though Bill Clinton had offered a public apology, it was rejected by the Chinese side, and they launched a major campaign to target the Americans. But this was done in a very calibrated fashion. So after some time, they backed off. Like in 95, 96, once Bill Clinton sent aircraft carrier groups Taiwan Strait, Jiang Zemin realized that, and I'm sure that was the advice of PLA also, that force differential between China and USA at that point of time was so large that Americans could intervene in an effective fashion in Taiwan Strait, something they sought to deny subsequently, and something in case of third Taiwan Strait crisis following Speaker Pelosi's visit, Americans could not repeat. So more than I think PLA taking a hardline position, it was Jiang Zemin burnishing his nationalist credentials. He was under pressure that both Chu and Chiang had been criticized for making concessions on the issue of WTO entry. So he wanted to sort of ensure that in these three situations, they were not subjected to domestic pressure. So they took relatively hardline positions without closing the room for reconciliation. All three cases, within relatively short periods of time, they could bring relations with USA back to normal track.
Right, thank you. Santosh, would you take on the two questions?
Sure. So first to your question, I think about politics and economics. I think China understands strength, and now really India has an opportunity to strengthen its position in global value chains. And the reason I kept saying about learning from China is not in the positive way, but also by negative example. If China expanded too rapidly by ignoring environment standards and labor standards, we have an opportunity now to create a better alternative for the entire world. So, and once that happens, once that momentum catches up, I honestly believe that India will offer a better alternative. And that time, even if trade with China expands, our composition will change dramatically. Instead of importing finished products from China, we will be importing more of intermediate products because we will be selling to the world from India. And that is when I think strength of India's manufacturing prowess will hit China. And maybe that will generate leverage in other areas and so on. I don't know. Maybe that is still too far away. But that is the opportunity today. And if that happens, I think definitely we can change what you spoke of. Politics always dictating everything else. But we really need to work on that. We need to list out objectives. What are the sort of targets we are trying to achieve? Merely focusing on the trade deficit without sort of qualitative assessment is not going to help. Because if India has to become a strong manufacturing sector, we will continue trading with China for a long time because we need so many things that China makes. Now, what Shubhadeep said, China is now opening up and so on. Yes, but there might still be some obstacles in the next year or so. But again, every delay that China makes in opening up and restoring normalcy after COVID is, the clock is ticking for India. We need to get our act straight, and we need to provide a feasible alternative. If foreign companies can actually come to India, manufacture in a compliant way with human rights and so on, this is what Europe is saying essentially, and still make a profit, then there is no reason manufacturers won't come to India. But we need to demonstrate that now, and I think that opportunity of window has just begun in the last couple of years. It will continue for many years. The other point I wanted to make is about the aspect I brought out about center-state relationships is very important for India because we still don't know. I don't know about the discussions in the GST Council, but I don't know how states are being incentivized to attract FDI. We all know that 5 or 6 states get 90% of FDI in India, and that may not be sufficient. So we need to put in place some reforms domestically to make sure India emerges as a manufacturing hub. And that is again where we can learn from this example I gave of center-state relationships, whether it's tax reform or any other reform. We need to make states stronger and incentivize them. Central government alone, is not able to do this whole thing by itself on the economic side, at least. So I think those are my remarks. If I missed out anything, please.
Alka, if I could just add a
Sure.
couple of points. To your question on whether you can take politics out of economic engagement with China, my short answer is no, because given the nature of fraught relationship we have with China, it's very difficult to compartmentalize economic engagement. We tried doing that, we didn't quite succeed. Now circumstances have become even more adverse because there is an increasing tendency both by USA and China to weaponize interdependence. You see what Americans are doing in context of Ukraine war, and what China has done in respect to so many countries, including South Korea, Japan, Australia. So we have to be given a state of our relations. It's not just a question of trade deficit. That's a major problem. I will not underestimate the salience of that issue. According to Chinese customs statistics, first 9 months of the current year, our trade deficit with China was in excess of $75 billion. It accounts for more than 40% of global trade deficit. And it's not only because we don't have products we can't effectively compete with in Chinese market, but there are serious non-tariff barriers which we have struggled with for quite some time without getting satisfaction from China. But the more important issue is dependency in certain critical areas that has developed on imports from China, whether it be active pharmaceutical ingredients or electronics or solar power equipment. Very heavy dependency. This is something Santosh has worked on that. He has done research on that. And this we need to change. And this we need to change through various methods. I will not go into that. But without addressing some of these structural problems, just expanding trade with China is not going to help. And now getting more investment from China, again, that's we are ambivalent about it. So I don't see, in foreseeable future, going back to earlier construct with which I was closely involved, closer developmental partnership. That is, growth of China is an opportunity for India and vice versa. I think, unfortunately, we have moved away from that, and we are unlikely to return to that position anytime soon. Alka, if you permit, I'll answer a couple of questions.
Yes, please go ahead, sir.
In the chat box.
Yes, please.
Question from Colonel Roy about Yangtze. As Colonel Roy has rightly pointed out, it's an area where we have had problems in the past. I recall that before Chinese agreed to arriving at a common understanding of LAC in the agreement of November 1996, we were looking at our difference in specific pockets, and we had identified Yangtze as one of the pockets where we need to clarify the LAC. So there have been overlapping patrolling in Yangtze for quite some time. But what has happened this time is qualitatively different, because you had a very large body of Chinese PLA personnel coming in. A number given in media is 600, well prepared with sort of rather primitive but brutal weapons. And there was serious skirmish, not just standoff. This shows I think a pattern of behavior on China's part where they're trying to sort of change the status quo along the LAC. They did that in Western sector, in Eastern Ladakh. They're doing that in Eastern sector. And I suspect this process will continue to roll out. We'll see more of such incidents in future. This is not a rogue operation. It's not a local incident. It's part of a larger, policy decision taken by China, which is playing out on the ground. Coming to Kanish's question on two Taiwan crises, one in 95-96, which I referred to earlier, and one more recently following Speaker Pelosi's visit. I think in many ways...
Ashok, you could combine this with Nitin's question also earlier, sorry, just about Roy's question, which is about one country, two systems. Same, broadly the same thing.
Sorry, let me just see that, yeah. These two, second Taiwan crisis, the 95-96 Taiwan crisis and latest Taiwan crisis, they bring out very clearly how the capability gap between China and the USA has narrowed. And the US ability to intervene, intercede in such situations is so much less now. In 95, 96, Jiang Zemin had to back off because Americans had brought in aircraft carrier groups to Taiwan Strait. This time, Americans didn't do anything kind, and Chinese escalated, stopping well short of armed invasion, but they created a new normal in terms of their activities in Taiwan Strait, including repeatedly crossing the median line, shooting missiles over Taiwan, and so on and so forth. So this, shows that how today's situation is significantly different. For us, we have been rather circumspect about commenting on developments pertaining to Taiwan. But increasingly, I'm on the view that we should not look at developments along India-China borders in isolation. They're part of a larger pattern of behavior by China in 4 theaters, including Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, and India-China borders. And we should take a sort of holistic view and arrive at conclusions rather than looking at only as a bilateral problem with China. And perhaps we need to be more forthcoming in terms of what's happening there in Taiwan Strait. In one China, one country, 2 systems. Frankly, I mean, this is something which is not at all acceptable to people in Taiwan. They have gone well beyond that. Vast majority of public opinion in Taiwan considers itself as Taiwanese rather than Chinese. And in any case, one country, 2 systems has been completely sort of undermined by what the Chinese have done in Hong Kong recently, which also had the so-called one country, 2 systems construct. I think I have responded to these questions. Yeah.
There is one last one I think we can bring in, unless any more like hold up your hand now or forever hold your peace. Anybody? So Shubhadeep's got to come up with another one. Anybody else? Okay, so there'll be one last 2 questions, one from Surbhi, who has written in the chat box. After this, I suppose this meaning the recent skirmish, conflicts between both the countries, is there any kind of way that India, China can emerging their, I think there's typo. So after this recent incident, is there any way that India, China can normalize their relations, emerging before as they have? Okay, we get the sense of this. Shubhadeep, you can ask your question.
My question is to Ambassador Ashok Kantha, sir. You mentioned about that Taiwanese people, the people of Taiwan accept them as the more Taiwanese, and they don't accept this to one country, 2 policy. So my question is that recently there's a change in the head, and the person who is there is more aligned to China. So how do you think that will be in the terms of the relation between the China and Taiwan with that?
If I can answer Shubhadeep's question first. I think you are referring to local body elections in Taiwan, where Kuomintang has done better than DPP. I know traditionally Kuomintang has performed better in local body elections compared to national, presidential or parliamentary elections. It's a setback for DPP, but I don't think it changes basic dynamics of cross-strait relations, unless in the next presidential elections during 2024, Kuomintang were to come to power, because that will create a new situation. But in terms of assertion of Taiwanese identity, in terms of strong reservations in Taiwan about so-called reunification with the mainland, I don't think situation is going to change, anytime soon. Despite extensive economic engagement between China and Taiwan, politically the 2 entities have continued to drift apart in terms of how they look at their future together or separately. I think Taiwanese look at their future separately rather than as part of mainland China. Coming to Surbhi's question, no, Surbhi, this is something I was speaking at BHU yesterday, and incidentally, I also talked about treating China as an example, both as a positive example, negative example, as Santosh mentioned. But argument I gave that yes, I mean we have structural problems in India-China relations which go beyond recent problems along the LAC. So it will not be easy to bring relations back on normal track. But this is something we cannot give up, because China is our largest neighbor. China is the second largest economy in the world. It's the largest trading nation in the world. So we need to have constructive engagement with China, while at the same time taking due safeguards, and also combining a policy of seeking constructive engagement with certain safeguards, like deterrence, enhanced deterrence vis-a-vis China, or policy of internal external balancing vis-a-vis that country. But we can't give up on seeking normal relations with China. I don't think that will be in our interest.
Well, I think that brings us to an end to the Qs. That is part of the, I don't see any at all now. So it's also time for us to wind up. It now remains for me to hand over the mic to our MC to conclude. But let me also thank both the participants for bringing out some very, very interesting aspects of this relationship at a particular point in the history of India-China relations. There's also in our attempt to understand China's rise as a major global player. There have been ups and downs as far as India and China are concerned. Jiang Zemin period stands out for a brief phase when it appeared as if global, regional, and bilateral dynamics were actually starting to come to some meeting points, although, as Ambassador Kant said, that on the boundary there appeared to be a very, very obdurate kind of a stand, which could not help us. It just proved impervious to any kind of moving past. But it did establish some very significant economic foundations. It did contribute to some degree of political understanding, but then we see that we very soon come to yet another turning point. In retrospect, it just seems that we have moved from one kind of crisis point to another crisis point, but the periods between the crisis points have shown in general a tendency for the relationship to move in a more positive direction. What do we make of that overall in terms of both India and China as emerging players in the current regional and global order? These are issues that I think will bear watching, particularly since we are not at this point very sanguine about which direction this relationship is taking. But on that note, so let me thank you all once again for a very interesting discussion. And Arfina, it's over to you now.
Thank you, ma'am. With that, we have come to an end of today's session. But before wrapping up, I would like to thank all the panelists for giving us their valuable time and all the participants for their active participants throughout the session. The video of today's discussion will be available on our YouTube channel. We would also like to welcome you all for our next Wednesday seminar. We at ICS conduct seminar every Wednesday. Information of the same will be available at our website, or you could all subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you. Have a great evening ahead.
Arfina, if I may just add to that, this week we are having a special event which will take place day after tomorrow. And we will be having this event on the recent protests that took place in China in the aftermath of the 20th Party Congress. So this is basically about how we are looking at these protests and assessing them. So that's on Friday. Time is the same, 3 p.m. And we look forward to having you all with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Alka.